Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you another dark fiction wrap-up. So this is horror thrillers as well as some true crime, and in this video I was all prepared when I sat down to give you my best recommendations for Halloween, but then I looked at what I read and I feel like I'm failing at spooky season, because while I have some great books to recommend you today, I don't consider them to be classic horror fiction. And there is at least one exception, one book that I do think would work really well this time of year. But for the most part, these are the kind of books that I would read any time of year. They're just general good dark fiction. So hopefully you'll stick around. And as I've said in previous videos, I actually pre-filmed these a little bit. So this is actually what I read at the beginning of October. So hopefully my next dark fiction wrap-up is gonna be a little bit spookier as I get closer to Halloween, and I will fill you in about what I read over the Hallowed Eve and all of that. All that being said, let's just get started. First, let's talk with the one that I think is the best pick for Halloween. It's not necessarily spooky, but it definitely has that atmosphere to it, and that is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This is a book that I received for review from Orbit Books, and I believe it's technically a re-release of a book that, I don't know if it was indie published before, but had a different cover. This one is so much nicer. It's really beautiful. It's hardcover, and it's just a really nice object. So this is a piece of vampire fiction, which is not always my thing, but in this case it worked very well. We follow a young woman who is on her deathbed. She is dying, and then a man reaches out to her and offers to extend her life, and of course she says yes. Little does she know that this man is Dracula, or specifically she doesn't know who Dracula really is until she gets wrapped up in his world. This is a book with beautiful prose. It is just lovely to read. It is very atmospheric. It of course has more of a historical aspect to it because it is very much drawing from the classic. Dracula is one of my favorite horror classics, and so I did appreciate those nods here. And yeah, I thought it was lovely. If it had been a longer book, I don't think I would have loved it as much, but you can't really see from this hardcover publication, but it's a very short read and I flew through it, and I like that. I've said before, and I will say it again, that I do think that horror works best in a short form. If you really love, say, gothic fiction, vampire fiction, and almost like a gothic romance, then I think you will absolutely love this book. It was perhaps a little bit more romantic than I would like, and not to say that it's just a kissy fest, because it's certainly not, but I don't think it is the scariest vampire book I've read. It more kind of plays around with the more, again, romanticized aspect of vampires, and so I liked it, and I think it will appeal to other people who will love these aspects even more, and this will be like a 5-star read for them. For me, I believe it was a solid 4 stars. I did enjoy it and do recommend it. Next, let's talk about my horror patron book club pick, and for the month of October we chose Experimental Film by Gemma, and this is the book that follows a woman who was involved in the Canadian film industry, and so part of the story is involving that we as a reader get to learn a lot about the Canadian film industry, which I will get into in a moment, and the other part of the story is more personal. It follows the main character as she is dealing and addressing the challenges of having a son who is on the spectrum. And so the story has these kind of two polar aspects that kind of tie the story together into what should be a horror story. And those horror aspects are there, but I didn't really connect with them. What I really struggled with in this book is the aspects involving the film industry. As I mentioned, I'm Canadian, so normally any book that references anything Canadian, I'm normally excited for, but the descriptions of the Canadian film industry were so boring to my taste that I just didn't care, and I really struggled to get through those sections. As for the autism representation, I always say that that's something now very close to my heart, and so I will say that the author made some interesting choices with really exploring the difficult sides of raising someone who is on the spectrum, and she doesn't shy away from the ugly aspects of motherhood, where you just don't always want to live up to the challenge, and you don't always want to acknowledge, or you're struggling. And this book is very much about a mother who is struggling, and she is trying to be the perfect mother raising a neurodiverse child, but she has a lot of ugly thoughts about it. So I like the book in the way that I think it's very honest. I think that this character has thoughts that probably other parents have felt before. But what I didn't love about this book was the fact that in the overall tone and larger representation of autism, it was seen as more of a disability when it's really not. It's a difference. And it was just seen in such a negative light that I felt like those negative or challenging aspects perhaps can exist, but with them comes so much beauty and so much creative diversity, and I just felt like the author didn't play the other side. My understanding is that the author themselves are on the autism spectrum, just like the main character in the story, and so I do have to recognize it is an own voices story. I would be interested to know, and it's really none of my business, but I'd be interested to know if the author has a autistic child, because I just think that that perspective was just very sour to me, and it just really rubbed me the wrong way. And even again, if it's not truly bad representation, it's just not the representation that I want to read about. So I didn't really love this book. I didn't really like the horror. I didn't really like the movie aspects, and the representation just really missed the mark for me. So not one I recommend, one that I thought I was gonna love and was such a disappointment. Now let's talk about The Prisoner by B.A. Paris. This is a thriller book that I was very excited to read. I've read this author before, and in this newest book, we follow a woman who at the beginning of the story is kidnapped by some mysterious person and taken away. And so some of the chapters are from the present, where she is in this captive room. It is dark and she's just trying to figure out what is going on. I found those to be the most suspenseful aspects of the book. And then we also get this other perspective or other timeline that is back in the past. You find out that she ended up getting a job as a housekeeper after following a woman home from a coffee shop. And that whole plot line just felt very confusing and contrived and honestly weird. If someone followed me home from a coffee shop, I'd be calling the cops. No offense to anyone who doesn't think stalking is weird. But anyway, the book just really got off on a wrong foot for me, and it just never really worked. There is a major turning point within the book. I will leave this very spoiler free, but I did not like that turning point. It just didn't really make sense for me. There wasn't a aha moment. It was more of a huh, what? And from there, the book just really went downhill. If you know my channel and taste, you know that I love kidnapping stories. So the fact that this one was so mediocre is so disappointing. And again, I've liked this author in the past, so it is an author that I was very hopeful would bring out a new favorite, but this one was a big miss. I don't recommend it. If you're gonna check it out, I would personally say to get it from the library. Next up is The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. This is a follow-up book to Red Dragon, which I read last year and liked. I was very excited to read this one because most people consider this to be the stronger of the two first books. And so in the story, we follow an FBI agent who is working in criminal profiling and has to try to solve a case involving a new serial killer, and so she goes and seeks advice from this previous serial killer, Hannibal Lecter, who is of course in prison now. And so the story is them trying to track down this new killer, but also having conversations with Hannibal Lecter. And I have to say that this one really let me down. First, let me give a little bit of context to say that I've never watched the movie, so I suspect that that would have helped to make me love the book a little bit more. And just a few things just didn't work as well for me as I would have liked. One being the fact that I didn't love the main FBI agent in this one. It's a young woman, and I personally thought that the male perspective in the last one was a much stronger lead, and I was really hoping to have him be at the center of the story again because he is more of a relationship with Hannibal Lecter. And just some of the plot points, some of the things just felt a bit contrived for me, just didn't really work as I would have liked. And I suppose my biggest fault for this book is very much not the fault of the book, but the fault of me. And it's the fact that between reading Red Dragon and this one, I went on just a different path of reading a whole bunch of other FBI style criminal profiling serial killer fiction novels, and they were all just okay. And so this one just felt like the last one of a whole bunch of mediocre books. And even though this one was arguably much better than a lot of the weak books I read before, this one just felt very tired and tropey. But I fully recognize that it is tropey because in a lot of ways it created the tropes that the books that I've read before were obviously trying to copycat. So it's kind of a shame that I wish I'd read this book much earlier in my reading life, because I think it would have left a bigger impact on me. And that's what I hear from a lot of people, is that they read this book many years ago and have since then fallen in love with this kind of serial killer subgenre. But because I read all the ultra modern stuff first that came afterwards that promised to be the next Silence of the Lambs, I feel like the original kind of lost some of its freshness that I would have liked. So really disappointed. I hope I don't get too much hate in the comments. I know this is a beloved book, and I know it's me, not the book, but it just didn't work out. And as always, my book review videos are just really about my experience with the book, not a perfect objective experience or evaluation of the material. Next up, we have Blackwater Falls. I'm not going to say the author's name out of respect for not butchering it because I am not certain how to pronounce that, but this is a book that I received from the author for review. And this is a pretty much straight mystery novel. I wouldn't necessarily call it a thriller. It follows a detective who is new on a squad, and she is called in because there has been a murder of a young Muslim girl who has been found within or by the mosque. And because she herself is a cultural ambassador, she is an officer who is Muslim and has connections to the community, she's called in to kind of be a liaison. And so we follow them as they're trying to puzzle out the case. The actual setup was promising, but I didn't find the case itself to be as interesting as I would have liked it to be. But my main complaint about this book is particularly the main character. And it's the fact that she is a very insecure, unconfident, unknowledgeable, is that even a word, woman who I'm just not used to reading about in these positions. I would say it's much more of a trope to have the kind of strong female detective. And while it is a trope, I like that trope. And to see a woman who is kind of fumbling around, who is fainting and uncomfortable at the crime scene and all of that, just didn't work well for me. Maybe it's honest, maybe it's realistic, but I would much rather see the trope than to see this version. So I think that the author actually has some talent when it comes to their writing. I'd be interested to read more by them. I just wouldn't read in this series. I know they have a backlist that is a separate detective series, and I'd be much more interested to read that one because it has a different detective, which hopefully will be a stronger match for my preference in strong lead characters. Next, let's talk about The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. And this is a bit of a classic thriller that I knew very little about going into, and it was really fun going in blind, so I'm going to keep the synopsis pretty sweet and short. But in the story, we follow a man who appears to be a bit of a con man. You find out very early on that he is kind of not necessarily on the run from the police, but trying to lay low. And at the start of the story, he is contacted by the father of one of his childhood friends who asked him to do him a favor. He agrees to go overseas to go see this friend and try to convince him to come home to his family. And so in doing so, he meets his friend and they start to talk, and the story goes from there. I will admit that this book has a very slow start, which I think is more common in, again, older books. I think today in publishing, there's a lot of pressure for books to start out with a bang. So just know that it took probably at least 30% of this book before anything really happened. And at that point, I was almost not sure if I was going to continue because I was just reading this old classic book, and I was kind of worried that I had mistook it for a thriller and it wasn't going to be that, but eventually it did deliver. And once the story got started, I had a lot of fun with it. Because of the con man aspects, it kind of gave me vibes of Catch Me If You Can, but it's definitely a different story. And for those of you that have either read the book or watched the movie, you know that I'm not giving away everything that is in this story. There is more to it, but I think it's more fun to find out for yourself where the story goes. And I found Mr. Ripley to be a very likable character. I found myself cheering for him and wanting him to kind of get away with it once you find out what he is trying to do. And it was just such an enjoyable book. It is short and sweet, and I just had a lot of fun reading it. Highly recommended. I don't always get along with classics, even the modern ones, so the fact that this one worked so well for me, and really I feel like it's just a timeless book. Highly recommended to people of all ages, all backgrounds, that are open to a fun thriller that is just, yeah, a modern classic in my opinion. And finally, I want to talk about I Was Never Here by Andrew Kirsch. And this is a bit of a true crime book, but barely. Essentially, it follows a man who worked for the Canadian Spy Agency, or CSIS. And of course, the book is all very careful about not giving away any Canadian secrets, but he gives a bit of an insight into how he got into this field and what he did on the job. He gives a lot of anecdotal stories about things that he went through. And I will say that this is the cutest, most wholesome spy book that you will ever read, and it kind of makes me very skeptical of the national security that's happening in my country, because it kind of read like a story about a bunch of like boomer spies that don't really know how to use technology, and they just walk around and call people and try to get like interviews and go to like Tim Hortons and have coffee with people and try to get information about spy agencies and like terrorist organizations, all by doing this. It seems super sketchy. And so I don't necessarily know if I'd recommend this book to everyone. I think if you're Canadian and enjoy a book that has a lot of those like wholesome Canadian feels, you'll enjoy this book for that. But if you're looking for a spy book with thrills and excitement and secrets, you're not gonna find this here. Like, nothing happens within this book. It is so dry and slow, and it's cute. It's really cute. So I would kind of recommend it if I have any Canadian viewers, or if you're just looking for a really fun read, but it is not your average thriller book, and I definitely think it has a niche audience when it comes to appeal. Alright, so we made it to the end of the video here. I'd love to know, of the books I talked about, are there any that you're planning on checking out for yourself? I'd also love to hear your opinions down below. If you disagree with any of my controversial opinions here, Silence of the Lambs, I'm looking at you. And of course, I am hoping to read some more spooky books before the end of the year, so hopefully by the time future Rachel is watching this, she has done that and read some books, so you'll see that in my next wrap-up, which should be coming early in November. But in the meantime, I would love to hear, what are you reading this spooky season? Share your currently reading books down below in the comments. And if you're new to my channel, consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and true crime. And if you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up, share it around online, drop a comment, even if it's just a little pumpkin. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.